All right.
All right, well, welcome to our March edition of Come Grow With Us. With me today is Natalie Hoidal. She is from the University of Minnesota Extension Service, who focuses on vegetable growth and all things kind of related to vegetables. So we're really excited that she can join us today to talk about integrated pest management. Our April class, which is scheduled for April 21st, is going to be on indestructible houseplants. So we probably all have a few of those in our house. So we'll be talking about ways that we can get healthy house plants. So the link to that will be on our WCROC website. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Natalie. One quick thing though is if you do have questions, I would encourage you to leave them in the chat, and I'll be checking those periodically and giving it back to Natalie. And we can also end her talk today with more addressing of those questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, Esther. Hi, everybody. Like Esther said, my name is Natalie Hoidal. I work with vegetable crops, support mostly vegetable farmers across the state, but also work with vegetable gardeners on pretty much anything related to vegetable production. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll just jump right into it. So today we're talking about integrated pest management. So thinking about ways to manage problems, both related to insects and diseases, kind of proactively and thinking with a long-term lens in our gardens. So just a quick overview. I'll give kind of an introduction to integrated pest management. What is it? What are kind of the steps and the process of it? Then we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on cultural and preventative control measures. So when we think about management of problems in the garden, most things are best done preventatively. And so we're going to spend the most time talking about that. It's a really core part of integrated pest management. And then we'll shift to talking about, even if you're doing preventative management, there are times when things get out of hand. And so how do we handle those situations? So before we jump in, talk about pest management, it's worth talking about just kind of defining what is a pest. So I have this picture in my background here of amaranth, one of my favorite plants. It's a crop that I've spent a lot of time working on. But for a lot of people, I would say especially a lot of farmers in Minnesota, this plant that I consider and have worked with farmers who consider a really important food crop is a really problematic weed. And so when we talk about pest management, it's a lot about context and how an organism interacts with a specific environment. So in one situation, a specific organism may be a really important prized food crop. In another, it might be a weed. So that context is really important when we're talking about managing problems. Pests exist in really complex systems. So here I've got a picture of a Colorado potato beetle in the middle. And there are cases where you may have a few potato beetles in your problem or in your garden, but they don't get super out of hand. And so a pest, basically an organism becomes a pest when the conditions around that organism allow it to really kind of get out of hand and become problematic. So some of that is just weather and climate. Some of that is landscape complexity, like do you have a whole big field of potatoes, or do you just have a couple of potatoes in a garden that is really diverse and full of other things? That goes along with, do you have natural enemies present and kind of checks and balances in that garden to keep things kind of controlled naturally? And the other thing that's really tricky about pest management in gardens is that it's so often about human values. We all have different thresholds of what we consider to be acceptable. If you're selling, let's say, kale at a farmer's market, it might need to look really perfect. Holes can be problematic because your customers are expecting something really nice. But if it's just in your backyard garden, a few holes in the leaves aren't really a big deal. And so that means that when we're making decisions about pest management, there's rarely like a perfect answer to say, do this at this point, just because our values around what our plants look like can be really, really different from situation to situation. So I'm going to start with the introduction to just the basic framework of integrated pest management. I know integrated pest management, or IPM, sounds really technical. And so don't be afraid by that term. It's just kind of it's a term that we use to talk about basically this process of thinking about insects and diseases in kind of the context of the broader ecosystem. So we worked with the Master Gardeners last year to develop this kind of flow chart, and this is a piece of it that presents IPM more as a process versus a set of like specific rules or things that you need to memorize or do perfectly. So the basic process of IPM is that when you see a problem, rather than just jumping and trying to control it, it's a process of stepping back a little bit and trying to build knowledge about that insect or that pathogen or whatever it is to really understand the problem and the context of that problem. Once you have that context, you can then move into decision making, deciding kind of what you want to do about it, what level of management is needed, and then moving into finally control tactics after you've stepped back and gotten some more context. So starting with that first step of building knowledge, that can mean a couple of things. So let's say that you see an insect in your garden and it looks a little bit freaky. Maybe you're not a person who likes insects very much, but you don't really know, like, is it causing problems? Is it a beneficial insect? What should I do? So building knowledge can look like a few different things. First of all, just proper identification, coming to understand what that insect is critical. So I'm sharing a couple of tools here that are really, really helpful tools. One, they're both on the University of Minnesota Extension website. One is called What Insect Is This? And then one is called What's Wrong with My Plant? So both of these are really user-friendly tools. You don't need to know like insect taxonomy language. You don't need to know any sort of like formal language around diseases or insects. You just click, say you have an insect on your vegetables. You can click on vegetables, you choose your vegetable, maybe it's beet. Then you can say holes in the leaves or spots on the leaves. And it gives you kind of a menu of options that might be causing that problem. And then really nice pictures to help you kind of match what you're seeing in your garden with the options that it might be based on its database. So I really recommend these tools. I support commercial farmers, and I kind of am supposed to know all of the different things that could be causing problems. And I still rely on these tools really often. So they're really user-friendly and really comprehensive. So when you figure out what it is, some helpful questions to ask yourself are, what is the life cycle of the insect or the pathogen? What conditions does it thrive in? Maybe it does really well in drier weather or humid weather. That can give you some clues about whether or not it may get worse or continue to thrive in that context. Some things about how it behaves. So does that insect chew on the leaves? Does it eat other insects? What is its role in the garden ecosystem? And so sometimes you will see signs of an insect. So you'll see the insect, you will see its eggs, you'll see some really clear indicators of which specific problem or which specific organism is causing a problem. So here's an example of 3-line potato beetles. On the left, you can see the larvae right there. And so it's really easy to then say, okay, there are a lot of larvae here. There are a lot of holes next to the larvae. This is probably the insect that's causing the problem. And so now I'm going to go look up what this insect is and learn more about it. There are other times where it's not that easy, where you have a wilting zucchini, for example, and you have to do some investigative work. So both of these situations, you can go back to these tools. So What's Wrong with My Plant is great for this scenario where you see a problem, you see a wilting zucchini, but maybe you're not really sure why it's wilting. Whereas the What Insect Is This tool is really useful for when you can see the insect right there. And so by using that tool, it helps you to narrow down some of what the options could be. So if you see a wilting zucchini, 2 really common options, things that could be causing that are cucumber beetles or squash vine borer. And so that tool could tell you that those are 2 really common insects that cause wilting in zucchini. And then that'll help you look for the clues. So if you're looking for squash vine borer, you know that you have to look near the base of the stem. not necessarily something you might do without that information. So often it takes a little bit more detective work. So in general, when you're out in your garden, it's a good idea to kind of have scouting glasses on. So you don't need to be like out looking for problems all the time, but when you're out in your garden doing work, just kind of keep an eye out for things like plants that are shorter than their neighbors, things that look discolored or distorted, plants that are clearly wilting. And try, when you're doing that, if you see a plant that clearly has problems, like try not to be touching unhealthy plants and then going and touching healthy plants. Wash your hands just because you may be spreading problems, especially if it's a disease. And if you see problems or plants that have problems, it can be a good idea to remove those plants from the garden and also to collect samples to try to investigate a little bit further. Also, if you are transplanting, that can be a really important time to look for diseases, especially not so much insects. But you don't want to transplant unhealthy plants into your garden. And so that's an important time. Just kind of take a look at the roots as you're transplanting. They should be white. They should look nice and plump. If they look like they're sort of collapsed or turning kind of yellow or brown, generally that's a sign that something's wrong. And so I'm going to keep that out of your garden. So another part of building knowledge. So often with an insect, you can see the insect, you'll be able to identify it right there on the spot. But sometimes with diseases, it's a little bit harder. Even with some of these tools, let's go back to this what's wrong with my plant tool. You say you have spots on your tomato leaves and a few different options come up. Sometimes they look really, really similar to each other. And just using a diagnostic key like this on the internet isn't going to be quite enough to determine the cause. So sometimes for gardeners, it doesn't matter, but sometimes it does. And we'll talk about why a proper identification can help you to manage problems, not just as they're present, but into the future. So if there are plants that you really care about, you want to keep growing in the future, I usually recommend sending in a sample to the plant disease clinic, and they can help you get an accurate diagnosis of diseases. And so just some tips for that. So the University of Minnesota does have a plant disease clinic where you can send samples. It costs about $45. So again, like if you're just growing one tomato plant, maybe it's not worth it. But if you're a really serious tomato grower, you love to have tomatoes in your garden, it can be worth it so that you can find resistant varieties next year. And we'll talk more about that when we get to management. So if you're going to send in a sample, send in a range of symptoms. We sometimes have a tendency to send in the worst plants. So if you look at these 3 photos, I might say, oh, I really want them to get an accurate diagnosis. So I'm going to send in this 3rd picture because this plant is clearly diseased and they're going to be more likely to find a problem. But sometimes when you have disease pressure, that plant can be so far along that you get kind of secondary infestations of other problems. And so it can be hard to diagnose what the initial cause was. If you think about like, if you leave like rotting food out in your compost bin, other things eventually colonize that too. And so you want to send some samples with a range of symptoms from really bad to just barely infected. Also, priority shipping, you want to get it to them fast just because when plants are sitting in the mail for many days, they can kind of start to decay. And don't be afraid to send the whole plant. So that was just a few tips about kind of building knowledge about problems. So make sure you're identifying problems and sometimes even going as far as sending things into a clinic so that you can really understand what you're working with before you move to management. For those of you who want to do something a little bit more advanced or proactive, there are a couple of resources that we have to kind of help you anticipate the insects that you are going to see in your garden. This doesn't work as well for diseases, but there are basically insects that we see every single year in Minnesota. And so if you're growing certain crops, certain vegetables, you should expect to see those insects. So one tool, and this really is more for commercial growers, but it's still a really useful resource for gardeners to give you a sense of the insects that you might see. So one of those is Veg Edge, which is the University of Minnesota website. You can click on insect profiles and then profiles by crop. So say you're growing asparagus for the first time, you could go to that site, click on asparagus, and just kind of get a preview of some of the insects that you might see so that you can learn about them and kind of be on the lookout for them. Another tool is these crop calendars that we have for brassicas. So like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, a lot of Asian greens, pak choi. And then we have one for cucumbers and squash as well. And they have basically illustrated life cycles of the insects that we see every year. And then on the second page, there are management tips. So you can kind of be proactive about expecting problems versus just waiting for them to happen and then identifying them. So there are a lot of reasons to do this. There are a lot of reasons to have proper identification. If you know what's causing a problem, you can know more about its life cycle and how it behaves. You can kind of get a sense of the amount of damage that you can expect, and it gives you a much better sense of the management options that are actually going to be effective. And again, I'll give some good examples of that later on. So then that brings us to decision making. So you know what the insect is or the disease is, you've learned a little bit about its life cycle. So then we can move into this decision making where you're essentially trying to figure out, like, is the damage really that serious? Is it going to get worse? Or is this insect kind of at the end of its life cycle? Is the plant going to recover? And do I want to take action? And often in a garden, honestly, the answer is maybe it doesn't matter that much. Like you have a few insects, they're not causing that much damage, and you decide not to take action, and that's fine. But sometimes you will. So this is one exercise that I like to do. These two leaves have the same amount of damage. So they are missing the same amount of area. And I know this is streaming to YouTube and there's a lag. And so I'm just going to have you kind of write down yourself what percentage of the leaf area you think is missing. I'll give you just a second to do that. So both of these leaves are missing about 30% of their leaf area. So if you're close to that, good job. What we often find is that people tend to way overestimate the amount of damage that they're seeing. So many people will look at this and say, oh, it's 50% damage, 50% loss. So I just show that to say often damage is not as devastating as it may look. And especially with chewing insects like this, we tend to see a lot of damage in the upper canopy. So at the top leaves of your plants, you see more damage. But if you look a little bit lower, the leaves are still intact. So it's just kind of a reminder to get a full picture and kind of try to accurately estimate how much damage you're seeing before you jump to like going out and spraying or some other management strategy. So I showed these before. And once you've identified it, try to build some knowledge, but also make sure that you continue to keep an eye out on a regular basis. So once you see a problem, make sure you're keeping an eye on it every couple of days just to see how it's progressing. If the problem's getting worse, if it's kind of staying the same. So that brings us to management. So when we talk about management, it's, I think, kind of our nature to just jump to, I see this problem, I want to get rid of it right now. But with IPM, there's kind of a shift in focus to thinking not just about how do I get rid of this problem right now, but how can I manage it in the longer term? So if I do this action now, what's going to happen in a few weeks? And even what's going to happen a year from now? So often the management decisions we make this year can affect kind of how our garden does next year. So whenever we talk about management, we always start with cultural or preventative management. So in preventative management, we have a lot more options. Our options are more creative. They're often more effective. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on those and give some concrete examples of what preventative management in a garden looks like, and specifically in the context of a vegetable garden. Then we move to physical. So things like physically removing plants, physically removing diseased plants, physically squishing insects or knocking them into buckets. If that's not working, we often then go to biological control. I will say that for most gardeners, biological control isn't quite as applicable. That tends to be something we see more on a kind of commercial grower scale, except there's been a shift in thinking about biocontrol from this practice of like introducing insects, for example, that would be predators if you're pest insects, and instead just shifting to essentially having diverse ecosystems that can support natural populations of predator insects or parasitoid insects. And so that's definitely something that we can do in gardens. And I'll kind of loop that in when I talk about cultural control. And then finally, chemical control is a part of IPM, but it's essentially the very last step. So if you've done all of these other things, you have preventative management strategies and they're not working, you've tried physical control, removing the problem, you've tried biological control, and it's still not working, that's when chemical control comes into play in an IPM framework. So we're going to start talking about cultural control. I'm going to spend most of the time on this. So there are a number of cultural control or preventative management strategies that we can use to keep insects and diseases from really becoming problematic in our gardens. And I'm going to give a couple examples or more explanation of each of these. But a lot of these management strategies are actually effective both for insects and for diseases. So things like crop rotation, just incorporating diversity, using mulches, resistant varieties, practicing good sanitation. I'll explain more what that means. Things like timing of plantings. And then there are a couple of specific things that we can do for insects and diseases. So we're going to start out just with this idea of starting with clean seed. So this is mostly relevant for diseases, but really important still. So some diseases are seed-borne. And so when you plant an infected seed in your garden, it can spread and affect the things around it, at least that are the same plant. So if you have one infected broccoli seed, all of your broccoli can become infected, for example. And so make sure you are buying seeds from reputable companies. If you're saving seeds, that's great. But make sure you're only saving them from healthy plants. Saving seed from a diseased plant is one way that we can spread diseases. I'm not going to talk a lot about hot water treatment because that's kind of its own topic. But if you're saving a lot of seed, hot water treatment is something that can help to prevent the likelihood of spreading fungal diseases or bacterial diseases from seeds. So if seed saving is something you're doing, definitely look into hot water treatment. Crop rotation. So crop rotation is one of the most important concepts in IPM. It can be hard to do in a garden, but it's still really important. So I'm going to give just kind of an overview of why it's so important, and then a couple of strategies you can use in a small space. So in terms of why it's important, let's say that you have a garden bed that has broccoli in it. And so a couple of those broccoli seeds have a disease on them. We'll say they have alternaria. Throughout the season, if that is a susceptible variety, that disease is going to spread out throughout your garden and often will impact all of the plants in that plant group in that space. So you harvest that broccoli, and a lot of those alternaria spores are still going to be present either in the soil or often like you still have residue left over from plants. You harvest the head of the broccoli, but you've still got the root system and some of the leaves. So a lot of those diseases can stick basically to that plant residue. You can use the same concept for insects. So you have a plant that is a host for a certain insect. If it's an insect that overwinters in Minnesota, it will often overwinter right around the area where you planted that crop. The next year rolls around, and probably some of those disease spores or those bacteria, some of those insects won't make it, but a lot of them will still be present. And so let's say that you plant a non-host crop. So you plant carrots. That carrot doesn't support that bacteria or that pathogen. It doesn't support that insect. Those spores, if it's a fungus, that bacteria is going to essentially Yeah, they're going to continue to try to complete their life cycles that following year. But if you have carrots there and they're not a host, they're not going to be able to complete their life cycles. Whereas if you plant something in that same family again, you're giving that organism more food or more space for it to continue to complete its life cycle. And so it tends to only get worse. So ideally, this actually is more of a 3 to 4 year graph. You don't lose all of those, all of the disease or all of the insect in 1 year. But that's kind of why crop rotation can be so important. And so in a small space, I really like to think about beds. So let's just pretend this is a garden with 5 beds. I tend to put all of the plants from one family, so like the Brassicas, in one bed, all of the solanaceous plants, so like the tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes, peppers in another bed, the cucurbits in another bed, so cucumbers, melons, squash. So beds are a really nice way to kind of differentiate spaces so that you're fully rotating. And they also have kind of a physical barrier between each bed. You can also think about containers. So say you have a lot of tomato disease problems, growing in a container for a year or two is one way to kind of pull those tomatoes out of that soil where you've been planting them otherwise. So it's hard to do in a garden. And the basic advice is just to kind of do your best. So the next concept is just incorporating diversity. So let's say you are a cabbage looper moth. So you're flying through the air and you have essentially co-evolved with cabbage. So your senses are attuned to cabbage. You're looking for it, you're smelling for it, you're looking for its visual cues. If you come across a field that's all cabbage, you have a feast. It's going to be really easy for you to find what you're looking for and land on it and start eating. Whereas if you have a lot of diversity in your garden, that insect is going to have to navigate all kinds of smells in the air. It's going to have to navigate all these different visual cues. And so it can be a little bit harder for that insect to find what it's looking for. And the same can be kind of generally said about pathogens. So say you have a disease in your cabbage, it's as it moves, whether that's on your clothing, as you're moving through the garden, whether that's on the rain, as you have water movement through your garden, there are a lot of ways diseases move. If it has this kind of complex matrix of different plants that it could land on, it's going to land on that plant and not be able to complete its life cycle. So diversity is a really, really good barrier. And something I really like about this particular picture is it's really diverse, but there's still a lot of order. You can still see kind of the chunks of plants and plant families that are separated. The next concept is mulches. So this could be either an organic mulch like straw or a plastic mulch like black plastic or silver here. And so mulches are effective at managing both insects and diseases for a couple of reasons. So for diseases, there are many many pathogens that are soil splashed. So when it rains, that raindrop hits the soil and the raindrop kind of bounces back off of the soil. And so that rain splash can disperse pathogens basically up onto the leaves. And so by covering the soil, you essentially minimize those rain splash diseases. So any kind of mulch can effectively minimize that rain splash. For insects, there are a couple ways this works. With straw mulch, the main way that straw mulch helps manage insects is that it tends to support communities of more diverse insects. And so you tend to see more ground-dwelling beetles that may be predatory, for example, or other insects that can basically either consume or they can parasitize the insects that are affecting your garden plants. With the other mulches, some insects need to drop into the soil to complete a portion of their life cycle, often pupation. And so that black plastic can be a physical barrier. It can also heat up the soil a bit. And then for certain insects, I think cucumber beetles most famously, you can use repellent or reflective mulches And so the silver mulch just is like a visual cue that is confusing. And so it can keep them from landing on your plants. The next concept is using resistant varieties. So this gets back to why it's so important to identify problems in the garden. So resistant varieties are mostly useful for diseases. So say you have a lot of early blight in your garden, in your tomatoes, you can look up varieties of tomatoes that are more tolerant to early blight. So they could be resistant, where there's some mechanism that helps to prevent the infection, or they could have tolerance where they can still be infected, but that infection tends to spread a little bit more slowly or be less severe. So there are a couple nice places to look for resistant varieties. Cornell in New York maintains this website that's essentially just spreadsheets of every different vegetable. And you click on them and it has hundreds of varieties in the first column. And then across the first row, it gives you a bunch of different pathogens that can infect tomatoes. And then there are X's throughout it saying, this variety has tolerance to this pathogen. So it's a really nice resource, one that's maybe a little bit more like fancy or user-friendly. Although I would say that the Cornell page is really user-friendly too, but just in seed catalogs, they will often tell you which tolerances or resistances that variety has. And some of them, so this is just an example from Johnny's, they actually have disease resistance in their filters. And so if you want early blight tolerant tomatoes, you can click on that and it'll only show you those options. There are some resistant varieties for insects, but they're a little bit harder to find, I guess, than the resistant diseases or varieties that are resistant to diseases. This next concept, just sanitation. So kind of keeping the garden clean and using a few kind of easy, I would say easy to say, but harder to do practices that can help, especially prevent diseases from moving around, but in some cases can help with insects as well. So pathogens tend to spread mostly in wet conditions. And so if you can just avoid being in your garden when it's wet, that's one really good starting place to prevent disease from spreading. Wearing clean clothes can actually have an impact. I know some of us have like our garden outfit that we wear all summer and never really wash. It's just the outfit that's covered in dirt. That might be fine, but we do know that sometimes pathogens can spread on our clothing. And so starting with clean clothing, and especially shoes, like hosing off your shoes to get the dirt out at the end of the day, can be really important. So you're not moving through your garden and kind of dragging dirt around with you. One concept that I think is starting to gain some more traction is if you're using succession planting. So say you want to eat lettuce all summer long, or at least all spring when it's cool, rather than going out and planting all your lettuce plants at once, you plant a few today, you plant a few a week from now, a few a week after that. So you have more of a steady stream. If you're doing that, try to start your day in the youngest and healthiest plants and then move towards the older plants, just because those younger plants are less likely to have diseases and problems. And so then as you move towards the older plants, you're less likely to be spreading disease through your garden. And then finally, managing your residues. So both insects and pathogens can overwinter in residues. They tend to stay near the residues of plants. And so after you've harvested, so this field of, actually there's still cabbage in that field, but a few of those cabbages have been harvested in that bottom picture. Try to remove that residue and put it in your compost pile so that it's not staying in the garden. Or you can also kind of chop it up and till it into the soil so that it breaks down faster. Timing is another interesting cultural control or preventative management technique we can use. So I'm going to explain this one with a specific example. So this is kind of the life cycle of broccoli. So you take it out, you plant it. We transplant it in usually early spring. And this insect, the cabbage maggot, tends to show up right away. So cabbage maggot is a fly, seeks out brassica plants, and lays its eggs at the base of those plants. So its larvae emerge in the soil, and they eat the roots of brassica plants. So the roots kind of become a little bit engorged or gnarly, and they're full of holes. And often the symptom we see on the surface is just wilting plants. So they pupate in the soil, and they have usually 1 to 2 generations per year. And then by kind of like late May, as it's getting warmer outside, they tend to just kind of be done with their life cycles. They're not as problematic anymore. And so one way to deal with that is to just wait a little bit longer to plant. And so by the time that that cabbage maggot has come and laid its eggs in the soil, they're going to pupate, they're going to become larvae. And then the larvae aren't going to have anything to eat. And so they won't be able to complete their life cycle. So just by shifting the timing a little bit, you can basically skip some of the damage of this pest. And the same would be true for the most part for flea beetles as well, which is another insect that affects brassica plants. That's not the only option for management. People can also use row cover, which is usually quite successful. But just to give you an example of why timing can be important and how we can kind of work around the schedules of insects. Finally, I know this is a long list of practices. We're getting to the end here. Humidity management can be really important for disease management. So a lot of pathogens do well in high humidity environments. And so just making sure you're pruning to allow for adequate airflow is one really important strategy to keep things from kind of getting out of control. That also relates to plant spacing. I know in gardens, especially in small gardens, I've been in this position where I don't have a lot of space to plant. And so I'm just trying to like squish everything into a couple of beds. And it seems like a great idea early in the season when everything is really small and you're really ambitious. But usually that ends up being a situation where your plants just don't have enough space. And so they tend to have more disease pressure and just kind of competition for nutrients and light. Trap crops and companion planting can be a really effective management strategy. And this is especially effective if you essentially can anticipate some of the insects that you are going to see in your garden. So that comes from experience, just having a couple of years gardening and seeing which insects are present. But it can also come from looking at some of those resources like Veg Edge or those cropping calendars, just to kind of get a sense of what might be coming. So the idea of trap cropping is, I talked a bit about this a bit on the diversity slide, that insects they essentially use olfactory cues, so they're smelling, or they're using visual cues to try to find the plants that they want to eat. And so if you can kind of confuse them or repel them or attract them to something else instead, you can kind of pull them away from the main things that you want to grow. So some examples of this are mustards for brassicas. So mustards are in the Brassica family. So say you want to grow broccoli. Flea beetles are really attracted to plants in the Brassica family, but they're especially attracted to the really spicy plants like mustard and arugula. So if you can plant those at some point in your garden, kind of alongside your broccoli, you tend to pull the flea beetles away from the broccoli and to the mustards. Say you want to grow squash or cucumbers. Blue hubbard squash is known to be this amazing cucumber beetle attractant. And so you kind of sacrifice the blue hubbard squash, but you use it to pull the cucumber beetles away. And if you look at Yard and Garden News, we just put out an article about this with some more information. Row cover is the other one that this is less to do with diseases, more to do with insects. Row cover can be a really effective and simple strategy to just physically keep insects away from your plants. So you can see here, row cover tends to be, there are a couple different versions of it. This is like a spun row cover. It's agribon that adds a little bit of heat. There's also row cover that's more like a thin, like mesh net that doesn't add as much heat. It's just a physical barrier. So row cover is really great for the common insects that we see every year. So if you know that this insect is coming, just putting some row cover over your plants to physically exclude the insect is a really great strategy. And you have to do it ahead of time. So that's why it makes more sense for the insects we see every year. We know that flea beetles and cabbage maggots are going to be there right when we plant our broccoli. So covering your broccoli right at the time of planting is a way to keep them out, as long as you're rotating, so that if you do it in the same spot and those flea beetles emerge from the soil, then they're underneath that row cover with the buffet. But if you rotate a little bit, then you can keep them out. Same with cucurbits. So as soon as we plant our cucumbers, our melons, cucumber beetles tend to show up. So again, right when you plant, putting that row cover over is a way to keep them out. Same with potatoes and Colorado potato beetle. All right, so that was a lot of different control strategies, specifically preventative management strategies that you can use in the garden. And I'm sure some of you already use a lot of those strategies, but hopefully you learned about one or two new strategies that you can try. So that brings us to this next problem. So you're doing cultural prevention, trying to manage preventatively. But even if you're doing a lot of these things, there are still times when a specific insect or a specific disease becomes problematic. And I think sometimes there's this messaging that like you're doing something wrong if something gets out of hand. And that's not necessarily true. Sometimes the conditions are just right to really foster a specific insect or a specific disease. So what do we do in those situations? Starting with insects. Let's say you have a major insect infestation. One of the things that you can do is just physically remove them. And I think a lot of the times for gardeners, this is often the most appropriate and often the most time and cost-effective management strategy too, especially if you're on a small scale. So the reason that identification is important here is just that insects lay their eggs in different places, and their larvae exist in different places. So squishing insects often tends to be easiest if you can just squish the eggs. There are certain insects that lay eggs in large clumps, like what you're seeing on this screen. And if you consider every single one of those eggs has the potential to become an adult, it's a lot easier to just squish the egg mass than to let them become larvae or adults and have to squish them all. But other times, so some insects, like the squash vine borer, lay their eggs in the soil, and then their larvae bore into the stems. And so if you see the adult, you can try to squish the adult or knock it into a bucket of soapy water. But then you want to be on the lookout kind of around the stems for damage. And often you actually have to cut those out of the stems. So knowing what the insect is helps you know where to look to be able to kind of do some removal. Trapping is not necessarily recommended as a management strategy for most things. But again, for squash vine borer, for example, just putting out a bowl, like a yellow bowl full of water, can be a way to trap them because they're attracted to that. So trapping can sometimes be a way to manage an insect when they're present. Often it's not effective, either because you just won't get enough insects, or like in the case of Japanese beetles, I know we get a lot of questions about Japanese beetle traps. There are just so many in the landscape that a trap doesn't really do much and can ultimately attract more insects to your garden. If you decide that it's at a point where you want to spray an insecticide, it's really important, again, to get to know that insect and understand its life cycle. Because some insecticides, just to give some examples, are only effective, for example, on chewing insects. And so you want to understand, is that insect a chewing insect, or maybe it's a piercing sucking insect, then you're going to have to try to choose a different type of insecticide. Some insecticides are only effective or are primarily effective at certain life stages. So for example, Colorado potato beetle, as adults, they develop this protective shell and it's really hard to kill them with insecticides. But when they're larvae and they still have softer bodies, then you can effectively manage them with insecticides. So that's where, again, like if you see an insect, just going out and spraying it tends to be a bad idea. You want to really make sure that you're understanding what the insect is, and that will help you understand the appropriate types of products that you can use. That said, I think most gardeners generally won't have to use insecticides in their gardens, at least for like annual vegetables. But if you do, if you get to that point, the Master Gardener program, I think, is a good place to start to ask specific questions and get some support. For diseases, what do we do when we start to see a lot of disease pressure in the garden? One thing that you can do, and this is often more effective if you can do it early on, is remove diseased plant material. So here are two pictures on tomatoes. This first one is leaf mold, which is a fungus. This next one is bacterial spot, which is a bacteria. And so just to kind of give you a sense of why it's important to remove tissue, you see these black spots on which is the leaf mold. Those are full of spores. And so those spores can spread throughout your garden and infect other tomatoes. And so if you can remove them, you've just removed the way that this fungus can spread. Same with bacteria. They move a little bit differently, but the same concept is there. If you remove the source of inoculum, you can help to prevent the spread. If you are removing diseased tissue, try to make sure that you are kind of just thinking about basic sanitation. So like have a bucket or a bag that you're putting them directly into. Don't be touching healthy plants as you go. Try to only touch the diseased plant material and only do it when it's dry. When it's dry outside, that gives the plant a chance to kind of heal over that wound of the tissue that you've just removed before it has the chance to be exposed again to the pathogen. When you do dispose of that diseased plant material, kind of think about where you're putting it. So if you put it in your own backyard compost, it might not get hot enough to really break down that disease. So often it's better to take diseased plant material to a municipal compost site. And also when you're getting like mulch or compost from a municipal compost site, each compost site is different. And some of them follow the practices that would kill disease or weed seed, and some don't. And so it's a really good idea to ask ahead of time, did this compost get hot enough for a long enough period of time to kill weed seeds and diseases? And if it did, then that can be a really good source of compost for your garden. But if it didn't, municipal compost can potentially add more problems to your garden. And then just to reiterate, make sure you're only removing diseased plant material when the plants are dry. And if you still have residue in your garden at the end of the year, it can be a good idea to either till it under or remove it. So that brings us to finally, deciding that maybe you want to spray a fungicide. So a few things to know about. Fungicides tend to be preventative, not curative. And so if your tomatoes are already like all the leaves are brown, if they're really far gone, and you could say the same thing about landscape plants, say your lilacs are like totally full of fungus, at that point, it might be too late to really be effective. And so they're more meant to be used right when you're starting to see symptoms. Again, identification is critical. Not every fungicide is going to cure every problem. So fungicides are meant to prevent fungi. So make sure that your problem is not a virus, a bacteria, a phytoplasma, because that product won't be effective. So again, make sure you're getting proper identification. And then again, the Master Gardener program can help you kind of figure out what to do. And just weigh the pros and cons. We're learning more about the impacts of fungicides on the environment. We're seeing that they actually can have an effect on pollinators. So just kind of think, say it's like the end of the season, say it's August and your tomato plants are really diseased. Kind of what is the value of getting a few more tomatoes off of this plant? Maybe it's a lilac from your great grandma and it's really important to you. Like, just kind of think about what your values are in the situation, how important it is to kind of manage that problem, and think about some of the other options that you have, such as removing diseased tissue, just kind of deciding to get rid of that plant for this year and choose a resistant variety next year. And then make sure you're thinking long-term about how can I manage this a little bit differently next year with some of those preventative management strategies. And again, I kind of just said that, but keep cultural control in mind. And even if you do get to a point where you are managing something with chemicals one year, think about, again, what you can do differently next year, and kind of think through, like, what were the conditions that led to that specific issue getting out of hand. So with that, I encourage you all, just think about, this was a lot of content. So just think about maybe one or two things that were new that you could try in your garden this year and write them down. So with that, we can open up for questions, and I'll just put a few things on here for different ways that you can stay in touch with our team. We put out regular bi-weekly newsletters in Yard and Garden News, as well as fruit and vegetable news. We have a couple of podcasts and a couple of YouTube channels where we have videos. I think I'll just leave that up.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I don't see any questions posed yet, but we'll just give it a few more seconds in case anybody does have questions. I was able to take some of the links that you were providing in your talk and put them right into the chat, so it would be easy for folks to click on it and access.
Thanks.
So yeah, so those are available there. And maybe you could share what your email address is if they want to get in touch with you with any further questions.
Sure. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat here. You can copy it into the other chat.
Yep, I will let everybody know here. So if you want to get a hold of Natalie, you can find her email here in the chat. And I'm sure she'd be happy to hear from you. So thanks again so much, Natalie, for joining us today for our Come Grow With Us program. It's always wonderful having you part of the program. And you've given some great resources for people to find some great success with their vegetable gardening this year, which I think people are already starting to plan. So it's an exciting thing to look forward to. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Yep.
All right.
All right. So I just ended the live stream there.